Hello and welcome to Sleep Sanctuary, the home of the most restful and deepest sleep. I'm Tom, and I'm delighted to accompany you on this journey to tranquility and peaceful slumber. And now, without further ado, let's immerse ourselves in this relaxing story together. The Weaver of Forgotten Dreams. The little town of Oak Haven, nestled along the rugged coastline like a collection of seashells scattered on the sand. Salt-laced air, carried on the gentle sea breeze, mingled with the sweet scent of blooming honeysuckle that climbed the trellised porches of the charming clapboard houses. Life in Oak Haven moved at a leisurely pace, dictated by the rhythm of the tides and the changing seasons. Days were filled with the cheerful chatter of neighbors tending their gardens, the distant clang of the bellbuoy marking the harbor entrance, and the comforting lullaby of the waves crashing against the shore. Among the residents of Oak Haven was a young woman named Alara. With her kind eyes the color of sea glass and hair the shade of sun-bleached driftwood, she possessed a quiet grace that seemed to mirror the tranquility of her surroundings. Alara was in her early 20s, and most days you could find her amidst the towering shelves of the Book Nook, the town's beloved independent bookstore where she worked. She had a particular fondness for the worn pages of old fairy tales and the sweeping narratives of classic novels, her imagination often taking flight within their ink-stained worlds. Even when she wasn't surrounded by stories, Alara found herself drawn to the natural world that embraced Oak Haven. She loved to wander along the winding coastal paths, the wild roses and sea lavender brushing against her ankles as she gazed out at the endless expanse of the ocean. But her favorite place was the Whispering Woods, a stretch of ancient woodland that began just beyond the edge of town. Unlike the boisterous energy of the sea, the Whispering Woods offered a different kind of solace, a hushed green sanctuary where sunlight filtered through the leaves in emerald shafts and the air hummed with the quiet symphony of nature. From a young age, Alara had been captivated by the realm of dreams. She remembered her own dreams with vivid clarity, intricate tapestries woven from the threads of her waking life and the boundless landscapes of her subconscious. She often pondered the nature of these nocturnal journeys, wondering about the strange logic and potent emotions they held. It was as if in the realm of sleep, another layer of reality unfolded, a world just as real and perhaps even more profound than the one she inhabited during her waking hours. This fascination made her a keen listener whenever conversations turned to the topic of dreams, her mind eagerly piecing together the fragmented narratives shared by friends and neighbors. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Alara was shelving a new shipment of books at the Book Nook, Mrs. Gable, a kind elderly woman known for her vibrant storytelling and equally vivid nightmares, came in looking for a new mystery novel. As Alara helped her find the perfect book, Mrs. Gable mentioned having had another restless night. "Oh, Alara dear," she sighed, her brow furrowed with lingering worry. "The most dreadful dream, chasing shadows in a dark house, never quite able to catch them. It leaves you feeling so unsettled, you know." Alara listened with her usual empathy, offering words of comfort and suggesting a calming herbal tea she knew Mrs. Gable enjoyed. Later that day, however, as Alara was tidying up before closing, a fleeting image flashed through her mind, a shadowy figure darting down a long, dimly lit hallway. It wasn't a memory of her own. It felt foreign, like a scene glimpsed from someone else's life. The feeling that accompanied the image was one of frantic pursuit and a deep underlying fear. It was unsettlingly similar to the description Mrs. Gable had given of her nightmare. Alara shook her head, attributing it to her overactive imagination after a day surrounded by stories. But the feeling lingered, a faint echo of Mrs. Gable's distress. She tried to dismiss it, focusing on locking up the bookstore and the walk home. Yet as she strolled along the moonlit path, the image of the shadowy figure returned clearer this time, accompanied by a stronger sense of unease. It was as if a tiny fragment of Mrs. Gable's dream had somehow lodged itself in her mind. Over the next few weeks, this strange phenomenon occurred with increasing frequency. Alara would be talking to a friend who mentioned a sad dream, and later that day she would experience a wave of inexplicable melancholy, or a neighbor would recount a dream filled with joy, and Alara would find herself inexplicably buoyant and optimistic. These weren't just empathetic feelings, they were more visceral, like fleeting echoes of someone else's inner world. She began to suspect that her connection to dreams was more profound than mere fascination. One particularly stormy evening, Alara was at home, curled up by the fireplace with a cup of chamomile tea and a book of poetry. The wind howled outside, and the rain lashed against the windows. Suddenly, a sharp jolt of fear shot through her, so intense that she gasped aloud. It was a primal, overwhelming terror, completely out of proportion to the cozy setting of her cottage. Along with the fear came a fragmented image of being trapped in a dark, confined space. The sensation was so real that her heart pounded in her chest, and her palms grew clammy. After a few moments, the intense feeling subsided, leaving her shaken and confused. She realized that this wave of terror had coincided with the loudest clap of thunder of the night. Could it be that the sound had somehow triggered this reaction, or was it something else entirely? Later she learned that her neighbor, old Miss Henderson, who lived alone down the lane and was known to have a terrible fear of thunderstorms, had experienced a particularly severe panic attack during that same clap of thunder, feeling trapped and helpless in his small house. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. Alara began to pay closer attention to these strange occurrences, meticulously noting when they happened and who she had interacted with or thought about recently. A pattern started to emerge. The fleeting images and emotions seemed to be directly linked to the dreams and emotional states of the people around her. It was as if she were somehow picking up fragments of their nocturnal experiences, their joys, their fears, their lingering anxieties. A realization was both fascinating and slightly unsettling. Was she somehow tapping into a collective unconscious, a shared pool of dream energy? Or was it something more personal, a unique connection she had with the dream world? She didn't have any answers, but the question sparked a growing curiosity within her. One Tuesday morning, Alara saw Mrs. Gable again at the bookstore. The elderly woman looked more rested than she had in weeks. "Alara dear," she said with a bright smile, "I had the most wonderful sleep last night. I dreamt I was flying over a field of sunflowers, the sun warm on my face. It was so peaceful." As Mrs. Gable recounted her dream, Alara felt a gentle warmth spread through her chest, a fleeting sensation of lightness and joy. Later that day, while sorting through some old books in the back room, Alara found herself humming a soft, lilting melody. It wasn't a tune she recognized, but it felt comforting and familiar, like a half-forgotten lullaby. She realized she had been humming it almost unconsciously since her conversation with Mrs. Gable. That evening, Alara decided to visit Mrs. Gable. She brought over a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the meadow near her cottage. As they sat on Miss Gable's porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Alara hesitantly asked about her dream from the previous night. "It was just as I told you, dear," Mrs. Gable replied, her eyes twinkling. "So lovely and peaceful. I haven't slept that well in ages. Then, feeling a surge of intuition, Alara began to hum the melody that had been in her head all day. Mrs. Gable's eyes widened in surprise. "Why, that's the tune that was playing in my dream," she exclaimed softly. "It was so faint I almost didn't notice it. But it was there, a gentle little melody accompanying the sunflowers and the warm sun." A wave of understanding washed over Alara. Could it be that her humming had somehow influenced Miss Gable's dream, weaving a thread of peace and joy into her subconscious? The thought was both astonishing and exhilarating. She had unknowingly stumbled upon a remarkable ability, a way to connect with the dream world and perhaps even shape it in subtle ways. Over the next few days, Alara began to experiment more consciously. When she knew someone was struggling with a nightmare, she would focus her thoughts on them and hum gentle, soothing melodies. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing, keeping her experiments private for now. Slowly, she started to notice subtle changes. Her neighbor, Mr. Henderson, mentioned that his fear of thunder seemed a little less intense after the last storm. A young boy in town, who often had trouble sleeping, told his mother he had dreamt of playing with friendly, glowing fireflies. While these were small, anecdotal observations, Alara felt a growing sense of purpose. She had a gift, an unusual connection to the world of dreams, and perhaps she could use it to bring comfort and peace to those around her. The thought filled her with a quiet excitement, a sense that she was on the verge of discovering something truly extraordinary. However, amidst this burgeoning sense of wonder, a subtle unease began to creep into Alara's own dreams. They were no longer the vivid, imaginative landscape she was used to. Instead, she started experiencing fleeting glimpses of shadows lurking at the edges of her dreamscapes, a whisper of cold air that sent a shiver down her spine, and a vague feeling of something precious being just out of reach, always fading before she could grasp it. These were unsettling sensations, a subtle hint that her connection to the dream world might not be entirely benign, that perhaps there were other forces at play in the realm of slumber, forces that were not as gentle and benevolent as the melodies that flowed from her heart. This realization planted a seed of caution in Alara's mind, a quiet whisper of warning amidst the symphony of her newfound abilities. A few days later, Alara decided to visit Mrs. Albright, the retired librarian of Oak Haven. Miss Albright was known for her wisdom and her knowledge of local history and unusual phenomena. Alara had always felt a special connection with her, a sense of wisdom and gentleness radiating from the older woman. Alara found Mrs. Albright sitting and reading in the small garden behind her house, where vibrant climbing roses competed to show off their blooms. Alara hesitated for a moment before speaking, feeling a little apprehensive about sharing something so strange. "Good afternoon, Miss Albright," Alara said softly. "Good afternoon, dear Alara," Mrs. Albright replied, looking up over her gold-rimmed glasses. "What is it, my dear? You seem a little troubled." Alara took a deep breath, trying to organize the jumble of thoughts in her head. "Mrs. Albright, something strange has been happening to me, and I don't know how to explain it." And then, Alara told Mrs. Albright about her strange experiences, the fleeting images, the inexplicable emotions, and especially the connection between the melodies she hummed and the dreams of those around her. Mrs. Albright listened attentively, her kind eyes never leaving Alara's worried face. When Alara finished her story, Mrs. Albright was silent for a moment, then gently placed her book on the table. "Alara," she said, her voice warm and thoughtful, "what you're telling me, it's a special gift, a rare ability." Alara looked at her in surprise. "A gift? But it's so strange, I don't understand it at all." Mrs. Albright smiled kindly. "You might be a weaver of forgotten dreams, Alara. I've heard of people like you in old tales, people who have the ability to connect with the dream world and bring comfort to troubled souls. A weaver of forgotten dreams, Alara repeated, feeling the name was both foreign and familiar. Yes, Miss Albright nodded. Dreams are not just fleeting images in the darkness of night. They carry emotions, memories, experiences that we sometimes forget when we wake up. But those forgotten dreams still exist, lingering somewhere in our subconscious, and they can affect our mood and well-being. Mrs. Albright explained that weavers of forgotten dreams have the ability to sense and even influence these dreams. They can gently evoke beautiful memories that have been forgotten, soothe hidden fears, and bring peace to dreams that are troubled. Your ability to hum those melodies, Mrs. Albright continued, is perhaps your way of connecting with the dream world. Music has a magical power to touch the deepest parts of our souls, and perhaps it is also the key for you to open the door to the world of dreams. Miss Albright told Alara ancient stories about weavers of forgotten dreams from the past, people who had used their gift to heal spiritual wounds and bring happiness to their communities. She emphasized that this was a precious ability but also one that needed to be used with caution and responsibility. Alara listened to Mrs. Albright with rapt attention, feeling a new understanding dawning in her mind. Her strange experiences no longer seemed frightening but became part of something larger and more meaningful. So, what should I do now, Mrs. Albright? Alara asked, feeling both curious and a little anxious. Start by exploring your ability gently, Miss Albright advised. Focus on people you trust, those who are having trouble sleeping or experiencing negative emotions. Hum the melodies from your heart and observe what happens. Listen for the subtle signs from the dream world. Following Miss Albright's advice, Alara began to experiment with her ability cautiously. She started with close friends in town whom she knew were having sleep problems. She would think about them before sleep, humming gentle melodies in her mind, and observe the changes in the following days. Mrs. Miller, the owner of the bakery on the corner, often complained about restless nights. After a few nights of Alara focusing on her, Mrs. Miller mentioned having had beautiful dreams of her childhood, happy memories she had almost forgotten. Mr. Harrison, who lived alone at the end of the street and was often haunted by nightmares after losing his beloved wife, said that his dreams had become more peaceful, no longer filled with frightening images. These small successes brought Alara great confidence and joy. She felt she was truly helping people, bringing a little light and peace to their lives even in their sleep. She began to spend more time in her quiet garden, or by the deserted beach, practicing her ability to hum healing melodies, listening to the whispers of the wind and the waves and feeling her connection to the dream world growing stronger. However, as Alara explored her ability more deeply, her own strange dreams also became clearer. The fleeting shadows were no longer vague images but began to take on more distinct shapes, like dark figures lurking in the darkness. The cold feeling also became more pronounced, like a chilling breeze blowing through her soul, and the feeling of something precious being lost became increasingly haunting, like a nameless sorrow always hovering somewhere in her mind. One night, Alara dreamt she was standing in a dark and cold forest. Tall trees with bare branches reached up to the black sky, and not a single ray of light could penetrate the dense canopy. She felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness and fear, as if she were lost in a strange and dangerous place. Suddenly she heard a whisper, a hoarse and cold voice echoing in the darkness. "The dreams, they will belong to me." Alara woke up with a start, cold sweat beading on her forehead. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the feeling of fear still haunted her even when she was awake. This dream was different from the fleeting ones before. It was clear, terrifying, and carried a threatening meaning. Alara knew that the shadow she had sensed in her dreams was not just a figment of her imagination. There was a force existing in the dream world, a dark and terrifying force, and it seemed to be targeting the dreams she was trying to protect. The feeling of unease in Alara's heart grew stronger, signaling that her journey of discovering her gift might not only hold good and peaceful things. A few days later, Alara decided to visit Mrs. Albright again. She needed her help and advice to deal with what was happening. She felt she was standing at a crucial crossroads, and the decisions she made would affect not only herself but also the people she was trying to help. When Alara told Miss Albright about her dark dreams, the older woman's kind face grew serious. She listened carefully without interrupting, and when Alara finished, she was silent for a long moment, her eyes looking into the distance as if pondering something very profound. "Alara," Miss Albright said finally, her voice lower, "what you are experiencing is a sign that your power is attracting the attention of other forces in the dream world. That world is not just filled with light and peace, but also with darkness and malicious intentions." She explained that forgotten dreams not only held positive memories and emotions but could also store fears, regrets, and negative energies. Some beings in the dream world could seek to exploit these energies to increase their own power. "The shadow you saw in your dream," Mrs. Albright said, "could be one of those beings. It can sense your power, your ability to weave forgotten dreams, and it wants to seize that power for itself." Alara felt a wave of fear spread through her heart. She had never thought that her gift could attract such dangers. She only wanted to help people, to bring them peaceful sleep. But now she had become the target of a dark force. "So, what should I do, Mrs. Albright?" Alara asked, her voice trembling. "You need to learn how to protect yourself and the dreams you are weaving," Mrs. Albright replied. "Great power comes with great responsibility. You need to train your ability, learn to distinguish between light and darkness in the dream world, and find ways to resist the forces of evil." Mrs. Albright began to teach Alara about the dream world, its rules and the beings that existed there. She taught her how to strengthen her mental fortitude, how to create protective shields in her dreams, and how to use her music as a weapon against the darkness. Alara learned diligently and seriously. She knew that this was no longer just about helping others but also about protecting herself and the balance of the dream world. She spent more time meditating, focusing on her inner strength and practicing the protective melodies that Mrs. Albright had taught her. While Alara was training her abilities, the signs of the dark force continued to appear in her dreams and in the dreams of others. People in town began to talk about more strange and frightening nightmares, dreams of loss, loneliness, and a shadow always lurking behind. Alara felt that time was running out. The dark force was growing stronger, and it was trying to invade the dream world of the people of Oakhaven. She knew she had to act, and act quickly, to protect the forgotten dreams and bring peace to everyone. One night, Alara had a particularly vivid dream. She saw herself standing in the center of the Whispering Woods, but the woods were no longer peaceful and lush as she usually found them. Instead, the trees had become withered and black, the leaves falling like ashes. A thick fog shrouded everything, making the space gloomy and cold. She heard the cold whisper echoing from all directions, meaningless words but full of threat. Alara felt an evil presence lurking somewhere in the fog, watching her every step. Suddenly the fog dissipated, and Alara saw a figure standing before her. It was a tall and gaunt creature, its entire body covered in dark. It had no clear face, only two deep eye sockets emitting a terrifying red glow. The creature raised a bony hand towards Alara, and a dark energy shot out trying to bind her. Alara felt a terror beyond words, but at the same time, a hidden power within her surged. Instinctively, Alara began to hum a melody. It was a strong and clear melody, containing all her resilience and hope. The music echoed through the forest,
dispelling the dark fog and pushing back the shadow that was approaching. The shadow creature seemed to be hurt by Alara's music. It hissed in pain and recoiled, its red eye sockets flashing with anger. Then it vanished into the darkness, leaving Alara alone in the forest that was slowly coming back to life. When Alara woke up, she felt tired but also full of determination. This dream had shown her more clearly the nature of the enemy she was facing. It was not just a vague shadow, but a real evil force, trying to invade the dream world, and sow fear and darkness. Alara knew she couldn't run away. She had to face this challenge, not only for herself, but also for all the people she had been and was trying to help. She needed to train her power further, learn how to use her gift most effectively to fight the darkness. She went to Miss Alara and told her about her latest dream. Mrs. Albright listened carefully, then nodded slowly. "Alara," she said, "you have seen your enemy. It is the shadow of forgotten dreams, an ancient being that feeds on stolen dreams and buried memory. It grows stronger when people forget their hopes and joys." Mrs. Albright explained that the shadow of forgotten dreams was trying to devour beautiful dreams and replace them with nightmares, sowing despair and causing people to lose faith in life. "But why is it targeting me?" Alara asked. "Because you have the ability to weave forgotten dreams," Mrs. Albright replied. "You are bringing light into the places it wants to cover in darkness. Your power is its greatest threat." Mrs. Albright said that Alara was not alone in this fight. In the past, there had been other weavers of forgotten dreams who had stood up against the shadow of forgotten dreams, and they had left behind traces and guidance that could help Alara. "Your journey has just begun, Alara," Mrs. Albright said with a steadfast look. "You will have to learn more, seek allies, and discover the secrets of the dream world. But I believe you have enough strength and courage to face this challenge." Alara looked into Mrs. Albright's kind but determined eyes, and a flame of hope ignited in her heart. She was no longer afraid. She knew what she had to do. She was the weaver of forgotten dreams, and she would protect the dreams of the world, no matter how terrifying the darkness she had to face.